Hello, I'm just going to click into Facebook so I can do this simultaneously. So please bear with me for 1 second. Hello. Today I'm going to be reading a book called The Mystery of the Portuguese Waltzes, and I would like to give a little shout out to Caroline Clark, who is, I believe at the moment, repainting her kitchen, who did the wonderful illustrations for this. And then I'm going to go and read the 4th chapter of Understood Betsy when she starts off in school. But first, for The Mystery of the Portuguese Waltzes by Richard Sims with illustrations by Caroline Clark. So this is a brand new book. It's only been out since the beginning of the year, I think. So fresh off the presses. And it has a very nice, the author has written a very nice dedication. So I'll read that as well. To the memory of the Portuguese cod fishermen and the Newfoundlanders they met, the songs, stories, food, and friendship they shared while in port and long after. For Art Stoyles and Captain Manuel de Silva. Actually, come to think of it, I'm also wearing a similar image by Caroline. Holy mackerel. Sounds, oops, that's not the first page, is it now? Oh, yes, it is. Holy mackerel. Sounds pretty darn good. If you play those tunes for me again, I'll tell you the true story of where they come from. The old man nodded to Tamara in the visitor's room at the senior's home in St. John's, Newfoundland. The young girl rested her chin on her accordion and looked at Art Stoyles' face, pale blue eyes beaming back at her, like twin moons reflecting on the water. Intense, magical. Tamara's father had brought her to play for Art Stoyles after they had visited her aging grandmother in the room next door. Tamara didn't think she'd played very well, her ears turning red and warm. She wanted to hide inside her musical instrument. Couldn't she just go home? But what was this true story? And anyway, why do people call a smelly fish like mackerel holy? The moment passed in slow motion, just as a coin drifts lazily when tossed, with a wish, to the bottom of the sea. Tamara finally looked up to find the old man's head had fallen to one side. His blue moon eyes blinked open, then shut. She stood up to leave. Oh, play him again for me, Art called gently. When I was young like you, Captain Manuel de Silva, he taught me some Portuguese waltzes. Her father nodded okay, so Tamara sat again and stretched the accordion. The bellows unfolded, wheezing in a great windy breath before she pressed the buttons. But soon her fingers were racing after notes that tangled and scattered in directions like frightened ducks. Her hands trembled, her fingers fluttered. Crashed again, she moaned, exhausted by the pulling and pushing. The Portuguese waltzes sounded like a mix of the ship in reel, running the goat, and something crazy the accordion was inventing on its own. Her father touched her shoulder. Art Stoyles was asleep. Why does it always happen? Tamara moaned. They drove from the seniors' home where Art lived with many elderly people like Tamara's grandmother. I fall apart when someone's listening, but it's perfect when I'm alone. I'll never win the accordion idol prize if I keep playing like this. Relax and practice, her father encouraged, turning right at the traffic light and then left back into town. Don't worry about perfect. Perfect doesn't happen. But she did worry about so many things. Hey, Dad, will those elderly people like Grandma ever go home? That is their home, Tam. I thought so. A long silence passed. Are they afraid of dying? I don't know, he said. Some are, I guess, but music helps. I don't know. What was that man's name again? The one who used to play the accordion. Art Stoyles. He was unbelievable. So where did those tunes, the Portuguese waltzes, come from? I'm not sure, he answered. No one seems to know, but everyone plays them now. No, Dad, he said something about a Portuguese captain. Right, Manuel de Silva. So is it Portuguese music, or did he make it up? No one is really certain, but this is the story I heard. Her father looked out of the window for a moment, and then began. A long time ago, when the fish were plentiful, the Portuguese crossed the ocean every year to fish the Grand Banks near Newfoundland. They were called the White Fleet because during the war the ships were painted white so the German submarines would recognize them as fishing vessels and not harm them. When they fished the waters near Newfoundland, they lowered dory boats from the ships into the sea before sunrise, saying prayers for safety and luck, and then each fisherman would spend the day out alone, dropping baited hand lines into the water. They would return only when the boats were full of the precious cod or if the sea was stormy. You see all the dories? And the white-sailed schooner? Oops, Betsy's joined us. Here, sit, cat. Cod fishing was lonely and dangerous work. Often the fog was so thick you couldn't see the fingers on your own hand stretched in front of you. Icebergs floated past, tall as mountains and pale as ghosts. Whales drifted under the dory boats. And no, yes, each year a fisherman or two was lost in those bone-chilling waters. When the wind sprang up, it howled in the ship's sails like wild demons and tossed the vessels around as if they were tiny corks. Then the Portuguese would hurry to safety in St. John's and tie up at the wharfs that jutted out into the harbor. That's there where Harbor Drive is now. It was a spectacle. Oops, Peter is going to die. There we go. The whole city smelled of fish in those days. Boats from all over the world came to port, but it was the Portuguese the locals loved the most. Groups of fishermen wandered the streets in their colorful checkered shirts and home-knit sock caps, looking at shop windows and chattering away. They bought postcards, nylons for their wives, and toys for their children. I was much younger than Art, but I remember kicking soccer balls around with them. For fun, the fishermen would toss us into the fishing nets, just like we were their own kids. You know, they were away for 6 months each year, and they missed their families. When he was about your age, Art Stoyles would watch for the ships entering the harbor because it meant work on the docks for his father, who was a longshoreman. When the White Fleet arrived, Art would hurry down to play his accordion for tips on the pier post. Sometimes the fishermen invited him on board for dinner. You're kidding. To sit down and play for people? Tamara asked. He wasn't afraid? Oh, everyone's afraid of something, her father said. But Art wasn't afraid of music. He was special. He practiced all the time, and in summer he played on that bandstand in Bannerman Park or on the docks. You could hear him all over town. He didn't go to school and couldn't read a menu or write his name, but people swore his fingers moved as lightning. He was a genius. The fishermen would gather around to listen, and they say that's how Captain De Silva heard Art play for the first time. Holy mackerel, she gasped. So that's where the Portuguese waltzes come from? Her father smiled and shrugged. Who knows? 2 days later, Tamara sat with her accordion in the third-floor bedroom of their house on Gower Street. "Relax and practice," she said. "Don't worry about it." She had just played the Portuguese waltzes perfectly, alone, well, almost. A seagull perched on the neighbor's roof, listening. It nodded and then glided away when she finished. Could she play as well again next Sunday for Art Stoyles? Maybe. Become the next accordion idol? Yes. For pressed against her bedroom window, blurring the view of St. John's Harbor. Fog pressed against her bedroom window, blurring the view of St. John's Harbor. On clear days, Tamara watched the heaving steel gray sea meet the quieter inner harbor waters. Maybe music comes from exactly that place where rough and calm seas meet, she thought. When she opened her bedroom window, salty ocean air rushed into the room, caressing her hands and face. Weird. It feels like someone I've never met before has come to visit. Her heart paused, the melody spinning in her head quieted, and Tamara closed her eyes. She tossed a shiny coin out the window where it landed below and rolled to a stop like a scrap of music drifting away in the breeze. Tamara made a wish, then grabbed a pen and piece of paper. "Dear Art Stoyles, can you help me? I love music, but I'm afraid of playing for people. The first time I heard Portuguese waltzes was when my dad played them on his violin. He says you're a great accordion player and used to live on Gower Street like us. Maybe you don't remember me. I tried to play for you 2 days ago. Luckily, you fell asleep because I sounded really bad. All of a sudden, something takes a hold of me. I get lost and I wish I could just disappear. But when I play those tunes alone, I don't want them to ever end. What's the secret about that music? Will you tell me the story next Sunday? Please? I hope you're feeling well today. Yours, Tamara, an accordion player." She tucked the note into an envelope, wrote Art Stoyles and the seniors' home's address on the front, and then sealed it closed. On Gower Street, she hesitated at the corner of Holloway and gazed down the hill towards the waterfront. What if her wish came true? Over in Portugal, there were so many fishermen named Manuel de Silva. You could fill a whole ship just with Manuels. Not just one Captain Manuel de Silva, but only one Captain Manuel de Silva ever sailed to St. John's, Newfoundland, years ago with the White Fleet. He came from a town called Il Havo, and his first ship was named Elizabeth. One year, Manuel nearly drowned when his boat wrecked on some rocks in a storm. Like many sailors, he had never learned to swim. The Portuguese captain knew the sea was dangerous, so every time his fishermen rowed out of sight, he feared one of them would never return. While they fished, he watched the horizon for signs of danger as the hours stretched like the deep, endless sea itself, filling him with a curious sadness. It was a beautiful blue-gray sorrow, impossible to explain or measure, like the ocean and sky. They say Captain Manuel had a good ear and could sing a tune perfectly after hearing it just once. He played his guitar alone in the captain's quarters when all the fishing work was done and the seas were calm. He would gaze through his tiny porthole window until a melody came to mind. One afternoon, long ago, when the Elizabeth was docked in St. John's, the Portuguese captain noticed a boy sitting on a pier post playing his accordion. "Oh, listen to that!" Captain Manuel had work to do, but he stopped to listen. He had never heard anything like it. Tune after tune, notes trilled from the accordion as the boy's fingers raced like flashes of light over the buttons. Melodies flowed across the docks, swirled around the moored fishing ships, and up towards the colorful wooden houses in the battery. Soon the captain emerged from the ship with his guitar. After an exchange of glances, the older man began his favorite tune, a waltz he always hummed when the sky was too blue and Portugal too distant. The boy listened carefully and then searched for the same melodies on his accordion. Over and over they played together, each time sweeter and brighter. People stopped to listen, enchanted, and soon a group surrounded them, swaying from side to side. After a time, Captain Manuel fell silent and listened to Art playing alone. He remembered his own son, Carlos, home in Portugal, playing such tunes on his violin. Ah, bonitas, Captain Manuel whispered. Bonitas, Art repeated. Beautiful, beautiful. As valses Portuguese. Portuguese waltzes, Art asked. In drifted the evening fog. The listeners wandered home. Captain Manuel and Art played until the boy knew the Portuguese tunes by heart. Darkness. Tiny points of starlight swam in the night sky. So many Art grew dizzy gazing up. They sat quietly next to the rocking Elizabeth with no need for words or music. The beautiful blue-gray sorrow was everywhere. Don't worry about perfect, Tamara's father said. Breathe deep and start again. Sunday morning was cloudless and bright as a new coin. The music sounded better, but Tamara was still not satisfied. Out her window, a sweet slice of blue sky hung above the circle of untroubled harbor water. In an hour, she would visit her grandmother at the rest home and see if Art Doyles had read her letter she had sent. She took a deep breath and then played the Portuguese waltzes again. Hey, sounds pretty darn good up there, a voice called from below. Tamara and her father leaned out to find a woman dressed in black squinting up at them, her head wrapped in a beautiful scarf. She smiled in their direction, nodded, and then bent to pick up a shiny coin in the alley and drop it into the thick cloth bag on her arm. Who is she, Dad? Never seen her before. A homeless lady, I guess. When they looked again, the woman was gone. Tamara shut the window and packed up her accordion. As a ship leaving the harbor for the open sea blew its mournful horn, Tamara remembered her wish. Even as he slept, Art's eyes were pale blue stars hidden in the night. The door to his room at the seniors' home was locked. He could no longer walk the streets of St. John's as he had loved to do. He had often wondered where he was, but in dreams and memories he roamed freely for endless hours. In that rambling, stories emerged like bits of all the tunes he had ever learned. He was a child sitting behind the coal stove with a blanket over his shoulders, playing the harmonica his mother had given him for his birthday. He was alone with his accordion on the bandstand in Bannerman Park. He was hiding among piles of salted bacalhau in the hold of Captain Manuel's Elizabeth, sailing to Portugal. A group of Portuguese fishermen carried him on their shoulders as they sang Ave Maria and marched through the streets of St. John's. The nurse let Tamara into Art's room. Though he appeared asleep, his hands moved often. When she saw the letter unopened on the nightstand, Tamara remembered Art couldn't read. She sat quietly with her accordion and waited. The old musician seemed so far away, yet still very close. As if awake in a dream, she heard music approaching slowly from a distance, like a tiny, bright, ringing object she might catch. It caused her heart to pause. Then she too closed her eyes, and suddenly Captain Manuel appeared to her, singing in Portuguese, followed by the strange woman dressed in black from her window. The woman removed her colored scarf from her head and danced with it around the bed. Then she drew treasures from her cloth bag, a shiny coin, a delicate seashell, a fishhook, and offered the gifts to Art. Tamara's accordion sighed when she stretched it, a sound like the breeze that had entered her room a few days previous. Then her fingers moved over the buttons, filling the room with melody. Art opened his eyes, enchanted, just as when he had first heard Captain Manuel da Silva play the guitar so long ago. He could no longer play the Portuguese waltzes himself, but others like Tamara could. She looked at his face, and now her fear vanished, just as she had wished. Aye, so beautiful, Art whispered. Those Portuguese waltzes, you know. I composed them myself. And so it was soon after that day that Art Stoyle's blue moon eyes opened no longer. Friends gathered around his final resting place and they played him his Portuguese waltzes. It rained later that night, drenching all the wooden houses on the Battery, the harbor, the bandstand in Bannerman Park, the entire island, and that place in the sea where the calm and the rough waters meet. What's the secret about that music? Tamara had asked Art Stoyles. He answered with a smile and a flash in his pale blue eyes. Those who play and listen to the tunes might know. Until now, no one in Portugal had ever heard the story of Art Stoyle's meeting with Captain Manuel de Silva, or a tune in Terra Nova they call the Portuguese waltzes. People tell tales about terrible storms and shipwrecks, stories full of bacalhau, mermaids, miracles near the Grand Banks, and their dear friends in St. John's. They remember elegant schooners like the Gazella or the Santa Maria Manuela, and how everyone waved to the departing fishing ships as tides rose to collect their cries of joy and sadness. Such a beautiful blue-gray sorrow. In their coastal towns, the old Portuguese fishermen can still feel the tug of fish on their lines from when they were young men, and how their bodies ached with fatigue from long days on the rolling water. They stand silently now, sometimes for hours, looking out to sea and listening, as if the wind might soon carry them a distant music. And far away on another coast, early in the morning, a lone bird often settles on the roof of the bandstand in Bannerman Park in St. John's, where years ago, day in and day out, Art Stoyles used to play his accordion. Its eyes are blue stars, its head tilted windward. It fills the morning sky with song. So there's a little afterword, and I'll just sit back and read that to you. Art Stoyles, born in 1942, button accordion legend Art Stoyles grew up a few streets away from the waterfront in St. John's, Newfoundland. He began playing harmonica at age 4, soon took up the button accordion as well. Many remember hearing Art playing his accordion for hours in the Bannerman Park bandstand. As a teenager, he would play on the docks and pick up tunes from the sailors in port from all over the world, especially the cod fishermen of the Portuguese White Fleet, who invited Art on board to play and have dinner with them. It was on those boats and in Bannerman Park that Stoyles learned the Portuguese tunes he would become known for. Stoyles performed with a variety of Newfoundland musicians, including the renowned Newfoundland folk band Figgy Dove. He is best known for the Portuguese waltzes recorded in 1988 on All the Best Folk Music in Newfoundland. In 2007, the Art Stoyles Band recorded The World According to Art Stoyles, a collection of international and original pieces, including 6 tunes from his Portuguese repertory. In 2005, Art was awarded the East Coast Music Association Stomp and Tom Conyers Award for his contributions to Atlantic Canadian music. Art Stoyles passed away in 2015, but his tunes and unique playing style have left a lasting influence on Newfoundland's traditional music and musicians. Anyway, it is worth looking up the music. If you just Google Art Stoyles and the Portuguese waltzes, there's a bunch of the recordings are easily available. And if you know a kid who might like this book, it just came out and it really is wonderful. And it's being published by Running the Goat. And I'm sure it's easily found in shops in St. John's at some point when things open again. So because I realize I'm mostly winding up reading for friends and my own entertainment, I am no longer doing separate videos for picture books and chapter books, because that just seems silly. So I'm going to now read the 4th chapter in Understood Betsy. Tomorrow I will, at 4 o'clock, again be reading a children's book. I think I'm going to read Island Boy, which is wonderful, and about a boy who lives on an island. I don't know how better to describe it. It's one of Barbara Cooney's, if you know her as an illustrator. So I don't know if anyone has been listening, but this is a children's book. This is Understood Betsy is a chapter book that's long been a favorite of mine. That's about a little girl who moves to Vermont and has some rather startling revelations about what it means to be a human. So at this point, she has arrived in Vermont. She is about to discover the difference between going to an urban school and a small school in the countryside. And one of her biggest discoveries is that there are things like an ounce, and that the things you learn in school are tangible. And in this chapter, it goes to the next step. But I think you can just jump in. You won't be missing out on too much. Except you should know that she used to be called Elizabeth Ann, and upon moving to Vermont, of course, she's called Betsy, because Elizabeth Ann is much too formal. Chapter 4, Betsy Goes to School. Elizabeth Ann was very much surprised to hear Cousin Anne's voice calling dinner down the stairs. It did not seem possible that the whole morning had gone by. Here, said Aunt Abigail, just put that pat of butter on a plate, will you, and take it upstairs as you go. I've got all I can do to haul up my own 200 pounds without any half pound of butter into the bargain. The little girl smiled at this, though she did not exactly know why, and skipped up the stairs proudly with her butter. Dinner was smoking on the table, which was set in the midst of a great pool of sunlight. A very large black and white dog with a great bushy tail was walking round and around the table, sniffing the air. He looked as big as a bear to Elizabeth Ann, and as she walked in, his great red tongue hung out of his mouth, and his white teeth gleamed horribly. Elizabeth Ann shrunk back in terror, clutching her plate of butter to her breast with tense fingers. Cousin Anne said over her shoulder, "Oh, bother, there's old Shep got up to pester us, begging for scraps. Shep, you go lie down this minute." To Elizabeth Ann's astonishment and immense relief, the great animal turned, drooping his head sadly, walked back across the floor, got up upon the couch again, and laid his head down with one paw very forlornly, turning up the whites of his eyes meekly at Cousin Anne. Aunt Abigail, who had just pulled herself up the stairs, panting, said, between laughing and puffing, "I'm glad I'm not an animal on this farm. Anne does boss them so." "Well, somebody has to," said Cousin Anne, advancing on the table with a platter. This proved to have chicken fricassee on it, and Elizabeth Ann's heart melted in the smell. She loved chicken gravy on hot biscuits beyond anything in the world, but chickens are so expensive when you buy them in the market that Aunt Harriet hadn't had them very often for dinner. And then there was a plate of biscuits, golden brown, just coming out of the oven. She sat down very quickly, her mouth watering, and attacked with extreme haste the big plateful of food with Cousin Anne passed to her. At Aunt Harriet's, she had always been aware that everyone watched her anxiously as she ate, and she had heard so much about her light appetite that she felt she must live up to her reputation, and had a very natural and human hesitation about eating all she wanted when there happened to be something she liked so much. But nobody knew that she only ate enough to keep a bird alive, and her appetite was so capricious. Nor did anyone notice her while she stowed away the chicken and gravy and hot biscuits and currant jelly and baked potatoes and apple pie. When did Elizabeth Ann ever eat such a meal before? She actually felt her belt grow tight. In the middle of the meal, Cousin Anne got up to answer the telephone, which was in the next room. The instant the door closed behind her, Uncle Henry leaned forward, tapped Elizabeth Ann on the shoulder, and nodded towards the sofa. His eyes were twinkling, and as for Aunt Abigail, she began to laugh silently, shaking all over, her napkin at her mouth to stifle the sound. Elizabeth Ann turned wonderingly and saw the old dog cautiously and noiselessly letting himself down from the sofa, one ear cocked rigidly in the direction of Cousin Anne's voice in the next room. "The old tyke," said Uncle Henry. "He always sneaks up to the table to be fed if Anne goes out for a minute. Here, Betsy, you're the nearest. Give him this piece of skin from the chicken neck." The big dog padded her forward across the room, evidently in such a state of terror about Cousin Anne that Elizabeth Ann felt for him. She had a fellow feeling about that relative of hers. Also, it was impossible to be afraid of so abjectly meek and guilty an animal. As old Chef came to her, poking his nose inquiringly into her lap, she shrinkingly held out the big piece of skin, and though she jumped back at the sudden snapping, gobbling gulp with which the old dog greeted the tidbit, she could not but sympathize with his evident enjoyment of it. He waved his bushy tail gratefully, cocked his head on one side, and his ears standing up at attention. His eyes glistening greedily, he gave a little begging whine. "Oh, he's asking for more," cried Elizabeth Ann, surprised to see how plainly she could understand dog talk. "Quick, Uncle Henry, give me another piece." Uncle Henry had rapidly transferred to her plate a wing bone from his own, and Aunt Abigail, with one deft swoop, contributed the neck from the platter. As fast as she could, Elizabeth Ann fed these to Shep, who wolfed them down at top speed, the bones crunching loudly under his strong white teeth. How he did enjoy it. It did your heart good to see his gusto. There was the sound of the telephone receiver being hung up in the next room, and everybody acted at once. Aunt Abigail began drinking innocently from her coffee cup, only her laughing old eyes showing over the rim. Uncle Henry buttered a slice of bread with a grave face, as though he were deep in conjectures about who would be the next president. And as for old Shep, he made one plunge across the room, his toenails clicking rapidly along the bare floor, and sprang up on the couch. And when Cousin Anne opened the door and came, he was lying in exactly the position in which she had left him. His paw stretched out, his head laid on it, his brown eyes turned up meekly so that the whites showed. "I have told you what all these three did, but I haven't told you yet what Elizabeth Ann did, and it is worth telling." Cousin Anne stepped in suspiciously, glancing suspiciously from her sober-faced and abstracted parents to the lamb-like innocence of old Shep. Little Elizabeth Ann burst into a shout of laughter. It's worth telling about, because as far as I know, that was the first time she had ever laughed out heartily in her life. For my part, I'm half surprised to know that she knew how. Of course, when she laughed, Aunt Abigail had to laugh too, setting down her coffee cup and showing all the funny wrinkles in her face screwed up hard with fun. And that made Uncle Henry laugh, and Cousin Anne laughed and said as she sat down, "You are bad children, the whole four of you." And old Shep, seeing the state of things, stopped pretending to be meek, jumped down, and came lumbering over to the table, wagging his tail and laughing too. You know that good wide dog smile. He put his head on Elizabeth Ann's lap, and she patted it and lifted up one of his big black ears. She had quite forgotten that she was terribly afraid of big dogs. After dinner, Cousin Anne looked up at the clock and said, "My goodness, Betsy, you'll be late for school. Betsy will be late for school if she doesn't start right off." She explained to the child, aghast at this sudden thunderclap. "I let you sleep in this morning as long as you wanted because you were so tired from your journey. But of course there's no reason for missing the afternoon session." As Elizabeth Ann continued sitting perfectly still, frozen with alarm, Cousin Anne jumped up briskly, got the little coat and cap, and helped her up, and then began inserting the child's arm into the sleeves. She pulled the cap down well over Elizabeth Ann's ears, felt in the pocket, and pulled out the mints. "There," she said, holding them out. "You better put them on before you go out, for it's a real cold day." As she led the stupefied little girl along towards the door, Aunt Abigail came after them and put a big sugar cookie in the child's hand. "Maybe you'd like to eat that for your recess time," she said. "I always did when I went to school." Elizabeth Ann's hand closed automatically about the cookie, but she scarcely heard what was said. She felt herself to be in a bad dream. Aunt Frances had never let her go to school alone, and on the first day of the year always took her to the new teacher and introduced her and told the teacher how sensitive she was and how hard to understand. And then she stayed there for an hour or two until Elizabeth Ann got used to things. She could not face a whole new school all alone. Oh, she couldn't. Horrors! Here she was in the front hall Here she was in the front hall. Here she was on the porch. Cousin Anne was saying, "Now run along, child, straight down the road till the first turn to the left, and there in the crossroads, there you are." Now the front door closed behind her. The path stretched before her to the road, and the road led down the hill the way Cousin Anne had pointed. Elizabeth Ann's feet began to move forward, carried her down the path although she was still crying out to herself, "I can't, I won't, I can't." Are you wondering why Elizabeth Ann didn't turn around, open the front door, and walk in and say, "I can't, I won't, I can't" to Cousin Anne? The answer to that question is that she didn't do it because Cousin Anne was Cousin Anne, and there's more to that than you think. In fact, there's a mystery in it that nobody has ever solved, not even the greatest scientists and philosophers. Although, like all scientists and philosophers, they think they have gone a long way towards explaining something they don't understand by calling it a long name. The long name is personality, and what it means nobody knows, but it is perhaps the very most important thing in the world for all that. And yet, we know only one or two things about it. We know that anybody's personality is made up of the sum total of the actions and thoughts and desires in his life. And we know that though there aren't any words or any figures in any language to set down that sum in total accurately, still it is one of the first things that everybody knows about anybody else. And that really is all we know. So I can tell you why Elizabeth Ann did not go back and cry and sob and say she couldn't. So I can't tell you why Elizabeth Ann did not go back and cry and sob and say she couldn't and she wouldn't and she couldn't, as she certainly would have done at Aunt Harriet's. You remember that I could not even tell you why it is that, as the little fatherless and motherless girl lay in bed looking at Aunt Abigail's old face, she should be so comforted and protected that she must needs break out crying. No, all I can say is that it was because Aunt Abigail was Aunt Abigail. But perhaps it may occur to you that it's a rather good idea to keep a sharp eye on your personality, whatever it is. It might come in handy, to have a personality like Cousin Anne, which sent Elizabeth Ann's feet down the path, or perhaps you would prefer one like Aunt Abigail's. Well, take your choice. You must not, of course, think for a moment that Elizabeth Ann had the slightest inclination of obeying Elizabeth Ann. No, indeed. Nothing was further from her mind as her feet carried her along the path into the road. In her mind was nothing but rebellion and fear and anger and oh, such hurt feelings. She turned sick at the very thought of facing all the staring and curious faces on the playground, turned on the new scholar as she had seen them at home. She would never, never do it. She would walk around all afternoon and then go back and tell Cousin Anne she couldn't. She would explain to her how Aunt Frances never let her go out of doors without a loving hand to cling to. She would explain how Aunt Frances always took care of her. And it was easier to think about what she would say and do and explain away from Cousin Anne than it was to say and do it before those black eyes. Aunt Frances's eyes were a soft light blue. Oh, how she wanted Aunt Frances to take care of her. Nobody cared a thing about her. Nobody understood her but Aunt Frances. She wouldn't go back to Putney Farm. She would just walk on until she was lost and the night would come and she would lie down and freeze to death, and then wouldn't Cousin Anne feel someone called out to her, "Isn't this Betsy?" She looked up astonished. A young girl in a gingham dress and a white apron like those at Putney Farm stood in the tiny square building like a toy house. "Isn't this Betsy?" asked the young girl again. "Your Cousin Anne said you were coming to school today, and I've been looking out for you. But I saw you going right by, and I ran out to stop you." "Why, where's the school?" asked Betsy, staring around for a brick 4-story building. The young girl laughed and held out her hand. "This is the school," she said, "and I am the teacher. And you better come right in, for it's time to begin." She led Betsy into a low-ceilinged room with geraniums on the windows, where there was about a dozen children of different ages sat behind their desks. At first sight of them, Betsy blushed crimson with fright and shyness, and hung her head down. But, looking out of the corner of her eyes, she saw that they too were all very red-faced and scared-looking, and hung down their heads, looking at her shyly out of the corners of her eyes. She was so surprised by this that she forgot all about herself and looked inquiringly at the teacher. "They don't see many strangers," the teacher explained, "and they feel very shy and scared when a new scholar comes, especially one from the city." "Is this my grade?" asked Elizabeth, thinking it was the smallest grade she had ever seen. "This is the whole school," said the teacher. There are only two or three in each class. You'll probably have 3 in yours. Miss Anne said you were in the 3rd grade. There, that's your seat." Elizabeth sat down before a very old desk, much battered and hacked up with knives and with knife marks, and there was a big HP carved just over the inkwell, and with many other initials scattered on of all over the top. The teacher stepped back to her desk and took up a violin that lay there. "Now, children, we'll begin the afternoon session by singing America," she said, and played the air a little over, and she played the air over a little, very sweetly and stirringly. And then the children stood up. She came down close to them, standing right in front, just in front of Betsy. She drew the bow across the strings in a big chord and said, "Now." And Betsy burst into song with the others. The sun came in the windows brightly, and the teacher too sang as she played. And the children, even the littlest ones, opened their mouths wide and sang lustily. And that's where we'll leave it today. And tomorrow I'll pick up with the picture book called Island Boy and the chapter 5, which is called What's Great is Betsy. Anyway, thank you for joining me. Have a lovely afternoon.